Yes, indeed. It is called Lothric, where the transitory lands of the Lords of Cinder converge. In venturing north, the pilgrims discover the truth of the old words. The fire fades, and the lords go without thrones. When the link of fire is threatened, the bell tolls, unearthing the old lords of Cinder from their graves. Aldrich, saint of the deep, Farron's Undead Legion, the Abyss Watchers. And the reclusive lord of the profaned capital. Yon the Giant. Only in truth, the lords will abandon their thrones. And the unkindled will rise. Nameless, accursed undead, unfit even to be Cinder. And so it is that ash seeketh embers.
Hello everyone, this is Aegon of Astora, and welcome back to Dark Souls 3 Let's Talk Lore. This is episode number 2, being recorded on Sunday the 28th of August. I hope you're all having a fantastic day, whenever it is you find yourself watching this. So I know I was rather wishy-washy in the previous episode about when precisely we would be dealing with the introduction to Dark Souls 3 proper. And I originally thought that it would be much later, but the more I thought about the different things we have to cover in this particular episode, and about the things that we see and experience at the High Wall, it occurred to me that it was actually necessary to get it out of the way almost immediately at the outset before we got started with the world proper outside of where we currently are. And the reason for that is, whereas the introduction to Dark Souls 1 provides crucial context for understanding the larger narrative of Dark Souls 3, the introduction to Dark Souls 3 provides crucial mechanical context for understanding how the world has changed in the time lapsed from Dark Souls 1 to Dark Souls 3. But before we get into that, we've got a lot of dialogue to get through and a fair bit of exploring of definitions. So let's get started with that before we get into anything else.
Welcome to the bonfire, unkindled one. I am a firekeeper. I tend to the flame and tend to thee. The lords have left their thrones and must be delivered to them. To this end, I am at thy side. Ashen One, to be unkindled is to be a vessel for souls. Sovereignless souls will become thy strength. I will show thee how. Ashen One, bring me souls plucked from their vessels. Ashen One, to be unkindled is to be a vessel for souls. Sovereignless souls will become thy strength. I will show thee how. Ashen One, bring me souls plucked from their vessels. Ashen One, to be unkindled is to be a vessel for soul. Ashen One, produce the coiled sword at the bonfire. The mark of ash will guide thee to the land of the lords, to Lothric, where the homes of the lords converge. Ashen One, Ashen.
To Lothric, where the lands of the lords converge. So I know we had some repeated dialogue in there. I apologize for that. I was waiting for that last line there. So of course we've already produced the coiled sword and put it into the bonfire. She said the mark of ash. So I don't know what she means by that. The mark of ash. So note also that she mentioned that she's a firekeeper and that she tends to the flame and she tends to us, to thee, she said. But those two things can very well go hand in hand, in that by tending to us, she is also tending to the flame, because she knows that if we go out and we say, and that can be both metaphorical and literal. In a literal sense, if we go out and we get undead bone shards and bring them back here, then the flame will become larger. It will grow. And once again, so to reiterate and to clarify some of the things I was saying in the previous episode about Firelink Shrine, what I was trying to get across is, and fanservice is something that we'll certainly be talking about, because I feel like a lot of the story and the world of Dark Souls 3 is dismissed unfairly as fanservice, when that term is being used in sort of a pejorative sense, when I don't think that fanservice necessarily has to be bad. In fact, in a sequel, in order to make an effective sequel that wouldn't otherwise just be better off as its own game, you need fanservice. Because what's the point of making a sequel if you're not building upon the story of the previous installments? And a lot of the introduction, as well as the introduction, as well as the dialogue that we'll be getting in this episode, points to, again, the mechanical explanation for some of the things we see that might otherwise be dismissed as mere fanservice. So that is to say that things can be fanservice, and they can still be interesting and compelling in the context of the story, especially in the context of a sequel. There are other cases where that's not entirely... It's not so clear-cut, though. You could look at the Firekeeper as constituting fan service for fans of Demon Souls. Because in many ways she's very similar to the Maiden in Black. And just as the Maiden in Black tends to, if I recall correctly from the playthroughs I've seen, that the Maiden in Black tended to the candles all around the Nexus. This version, this Firelink Shrine is very similar indeed to the Nexus. And it appears as though she is responsible for not only tending to the flame, that is the bonfire in the center of the shrine, but also to the candles all throughout. Because when we go to the Untended Graves, or the Flameless Shrine, in both cases none of the candles are lit. There's no Firekeeper, there's no fire. Or in the case of the Untented Graves, the Firekeeper's dead. And yeah, so the Firekeepers are much more central, I think, to the story in this game than they were in either Dark Souls 1 or Dark Souls 2. Not to say that they weren't parts of the central narrative threads in Dark Souls 1 and 2, but I think they're even more central. And this is something that Miyazaki said in several interviews that he did around the release of Dark Souls 3. And we'll cover those interviews a little bit later on because, yeah, again, we got a lot of stuff to get to. But I'm rambling, so let's get to the definitions. So she said, to be unkindled is to be a vessel for souls. So if, once again, we type define : vessel into Google, this is what comes up. And obviously the first definition is not really applicable, but the second definition, very interesting, a hollow container. So that could just be a coincidence, but it certainly, in fact, it's likely a coincidence, but it's certainly, you know, a hollow container. So that is in some ways how the player character is perceived in this game. We're a hollow container into which these unseen forces, this unseen institution, and all of these people are, to some degree or another, manipulating us into perpetuating the Age of Fire, or you could just say ensuring that the link of fire is not threatened. So perpetuating the link of fire, because that's how it was put in the introduction. When it was said that when the link of fire is threatened, the bell tolls. And we'll return to that line a little bit later on. But yeah, for now, just keep that in mind. She also said that sovereignless souls will be a source of strength for us. Oh, sorry, I can't remember what exactly she said. Let's find it.
Ashen One. Ashen One, to sovereignless souls will become thy strength.
Yeah, so sovereignless souls will become thy strength. So, this was sort of a definitional rabbit hole when I started thinking about it. And there are a lot of possibilities that emerge out of this. So the first is just simply sovereign. So sovereign meaning a supreme ruler, especially a monarch. But then as an adjective, possessing supreme or ultimate power. Acting or done independently and without outside interference. Possessing royal power and status. So in the context of sovereignless souls, sovereign isn't being used as a noun, it's being used as an adjective. Because what is defining the noun, the souls, is the fact that they are without a sovereign. They're sovereignless. So that is to say that they don't have, or that could be to say that they don't have royal power or status. So the unkindled one is herself or himself sovereignless. But so are many of the other enemies that we're killing and whose souls we're consuming. But then there's also sovereignty, which is potentially important. So sovereignty meaning supreme power or authority, the authority of a state to govern itself or another state, a self-governing state. So you could perhaps look at this not necessarily at the level of the state, but at the level of the individual, in which case a sovereignless soul would be one who doesn't have any control or agency. And in some cases, that could once again be applied to the player character, who, yeah, we have choices of how it is that we want to express ourselves in the game space, but do we have agency? Because I'm not entirely sure that we do, and I'm not entirely sure that we ever have in any of the Souls games, really. Sovereignty in a jurisprudence context, per Wikipedia, is understood as the full right and power of a governing body to govern itself without any interference from outside sources or bodies. In political theory, sovereignty is a substantive term designating supreme authority over some polity, so that is to say, over some group of people, some public. It is a basic principle underlying the dominant Westphalian model of state foundation. So, we're not necessarily going to get into that latter aspect of it, but I did find this frontispiece very interesting from Thomas Hobbes, the cover from his text Leviathan. The sovereign is depicted as a person holding a sword and I can't remember what the other thing was called in its left hand. But if you look even closer, you see that the sovereign is also made up of countless individuals. You could look at sovereign as or sovereignless souls as being a commentary on their individual, they're not sovereign, they don't have their own agency, they don't have any power, they don't really have any identity. But you could also look at sovereign or sovereignty in the context of this game as perhaps a reference to the sovereign of the institution of linking the fire. Because, and there were a couple comments that questioned this, or at least one comment that questioned this, which we'll get to later, that question whether or not there is in fact an institution. But these things didn't, like this arrangement here, didn't come about by chance. There's no natural force that can create something like this, which not only indicates that, there was some purposeful action design here, but also that it adheres to a hierarchy. That you have the throne for Holy King Lothric at the top. And then those of the, I guess, lesser Lords of Cinder along the sides here. Although it's interesting that Yorm the Giants would be down here and the Abyss Watchers there, even though you can't return Yorm the Giant until you've taken out the Abyss Watchers. So, I don't know. But certainly the placement of Holy King Lothric's throne implies some sort of hierarchy. So yeah, so again, something we'll get into later on, but...
Another one roused from the sleep of death. Well, you're not alone. We unkindled are worthless. Can't even die right. Gives me conniptions. And they'd have us seek the Lords of Cinder and return them to their moulding thrones. But we're talking true legends with the metal to link the fire. We're not fit to lick their boots. Don't you think?
Hawkwood the Deserter is clearly, obviously, a reference to the Crestfallen Knights of previous games. But he's a little bit more complicated than that, which I really do appreciate. That he's not simply the Crestfallen of this game. He's more than that. But as with the Crestfallen Warrior of previous games, Hawkwood has given us our task. That is that we need to return the Lords of Cinder to their molding thrones. He also makes explicit that which was sort of just implied by the introduction, and that is that we unkindled can't even die right. We were dead and brought back to life. Why? Because, as was stated in the introduction, the fire fades and the lords go without thrones. So that is to say, the lords, I think that is to say, the lords are not on their thrones, with the exception of Ludleth, who is awesome. Even though his motives are unclear, but he's like a nice grandfatherly figure. I think that's why I like him. And yeah, we can't even die right. We're being raised from the dead in order to ensure that the link of fire is not threatened. Because again, in the introduction, when the link of fire is threatened, the bell tolls. When the bell tolls, the first thing that's mentioned is that the Lords of Cinder awaken. And once they've been roused from, I guess, their sleep, they're supposed to return here to sit at their thrones. At which point, and see, this is where I get kind of confused. So they're supposed to return here, but as was stated in the introduction, in truth, they do not. They're not returning to their thrones. So it's unclear as to whether or not we were raised from the dead as unkindled ash because the lords aren't returning, or whether it would have happened anyway. So that is to say, let's say the lords did return, and they all came to their thrones. So by the time we got to Firelink, all the lords were here and we were all good. Would they send us to the kiln of the first flame if all the lords had returned? Was it enough in that, perfect situation in which there's not really a heck of a lot of conflict in the world? If the institution of Link in the Fire, if that plan goes perfectly according, if their strategy goes perfectly according to plan, the bell tolls, all the lords return, an unkindled defeats Udex Skunder, comes here, and then do they just send us to the kiln? Because I don't know. I don't really know. Because obviously somewhere along the line the plan has gone horribly awry, and which is why we have to go out and return them. But that has me thinking about what the plan actually was. Like, what would the plan look like if everything had worked out? Because we wouldn't be strong enough to go out there. To go to the kiln of the first flame at this point and fight the Lord of Cinder, or the Soul of Cinder, rather. And what's more is, after we link the fire, do we too become a Lord of Cinder? Would they have to redesign Firelink Shrine to add an additional throne for us? I don't know. So the mechanics of and the structure of this institution is something that I'm very, very interested in. And maybe I'm the only one here who is so keenly interested in this. But this is one of the central questions, I think, of the playthrough, at least for me. But I'm interested to hear what everyone else thinks.
A pleasure to make thine acquaintance, Ashen One. I am but a humble handmaid of the shrine. Weapons, armor, trinkets, and spells. I've lots of little things to ease the burden of a weary traveler. And yes, I'm undead too, but not so charitable as to give my goods away. Ashen One, fetch souls and bring them to me. As is thy wont? No?
So she says, as is thy wont. No? So that's a word that, until 4 or 5 years ago, I saw someone use it and assumed that it was a typo for WON''T, but in the context of the sentence, it didn't make any sense, so I was very confused by it. So I Googled it back then, and I figured I would share the definition just in case anyone else is in a similar boat. So, of a person in the habit of doing something, so something to which you're accustomed to doing. So, my tendencies as someone who makes videos like this, so you would use the word in a context like this. As I am wont to do, I ramble on in my playthroughs. So it's a tendency, something that you are accustomed to doing. So we bring her souls, and in a way this could be viewed sort of as a meta commentary of the developer perhaps breaking the fourth wall and speaking to the player. As is thy wont. You know how this works by now. You go, you get souls, you bring them to the merchant, and they can buy things. But on the other hand, it could also be significant in that, once again, it raises questions about whether or not the player character has any agency, whether they're doing these things of their own accord, or whether they're just doing them because they're being told to do it. And we'll return to this later on when we speak to Emma, the High Priestess, but...
Ashen One, if my wares are not to thy satisfaction, bring me umbral ash. With ash, I'll fashion new wares. Is it not our sorry fate to sup on death?
So sup meaning to sip on something. And umbral meaning, according to Wikipedia, is derived from the Latin word umbra, meaning shadow. So if we're to just take that literally one for one, then what she's saying she needs is a shadow ash. I don't know what that means or if that makes any actual sense, but yeah.
Knowest thou of that soppy gossip? That cordial intrusion layeth the path to embers. And so thou art in need of a soapstone, Ashen One. Then thy pockets will o'erflow with souls to trade to me. Ashen One, if my wares are not to thy satisfaction, bring me umbral ash. With ash, I'll fashion new wares. Is it not our sorry fate to sup on death?
In other words, it's our fate to benefit from the death of others, which, again, when you think about it, it's pretty screwed up. Alright, we're gonna buy a few supplies here.
Ashen One, be sure to bring more souls.
I will be sure to do that. Hi, friend.
Well, a newcomer, I see. I am Andre. I serve at this shrine as a humble smith, forging weapons. You're in search of the Lords of Cinder, I trust. A toilsome journey, I'd wager. You'll require good arms. Let me smith you weapons. I am a smith, such is my purpose.
So the shrine handmaid mentioned that she is just like us, undead. As is Andre, obviously. So his presence here, if we ignore, the potential of this place to be some sort of purgatory or Dreamlands-esque place, and we assume that it's just a normal place and that, he's here simply because he's a smith. And he's somehow been finding work all this time. Smithing, well, I guess say somehow, because he's an awesome smith and because he's really nice. Presumably. That he's been able to survive all this time. Because souls keep you from going hollow. And whereas this was made this was just sort of said in Dark Souls 1 and 2. In this game, in Dark Souls 3, there is actually a mechanical example of how you can use souls to prevent hollowing. And we'll get into that later on, but again, not simply fan service that he's here. There are other reasons, other possible reasons for Andre being here that isn't just, FromSoft wanted to... So that's not what we're going to be doing here. We're not going to be looking at things and going, lol, fan service, FromSoft so silly. That's not what we're doing. That isn't also to say that we won't criticize things when they deserve criticism. But again, the purpose of this playthrough is to be productive and to talk about things, and not to just dismiss things as poor or lazy or anything like that. We're trying to be productive.
Weapons and protection are sturdy enough by and large, but when overused, they'll eventually break. When their durability is low, repair becomes a necessity. Use a powder, or simply rest at a bonfire. But should chance impel them break, bring them me. I'll hammer them back into shape. They take no pleasure in breaking, I assure ye. So handle them with care, if you would. There are two ways to smith weapons. Simple reinforcement is one, and infusion the other. Reinforcement is straightforward. It strengthens a weapon without altering its property. Infusion is a more advanced form of smithing that infuses an element. Reinforcement requires titanite, and infusion requires gems. Bring the stones, and I'll do the smithing. It's my purpose, after all. In battle, your weapons are your only friends. Forge them well, and they won't let you down. Another matter. Infusing weapons with gems requires a special kind of coal. My humble coals won't be any use infusing more unusual gems. I know, it's an awful shame, but it's all I have. Oh, please don't give me that look. Believe it or not, I'm quite thin-skinned.
That gets me every time. You and me both, Andre. Don't worry, buddy. I got your back.
Prithee, be careful. I don't want to see my work squandered.
So that some variation of that line is shared by many of the NPCs in this game. And I don't know if it means anything, but if you compare it to what he says when you leave, when you exit dialogue conversation with him in Dark Souls 1.
Don't get yourself killed. Neither of us want to see you go hollow.
So this is something I talked about in my blind playthrough, but it's interesting that he's gone, at least from back then, from being very empathetic, seemingly. He doesn't want to see us go hollow. Just as we don't want to see ourselves going hollow. And yet, in Dark Souls 3, he just says, well, be careful, because I don't want to see all that work I just did on your weapon go to waste. And I guess, on the other hand, that does show that he doesn't only care about the souls. So, I don't know. It could just be a case of them saying, well, we can't reuse the same dialogue, because that would be, that'd be a little bit cheap. That would have been lazy, if they just reused the same dialogue. But to some degree, it would have at least made some sense. But it could also indicate a hardening of Andre, or Andre just becoming more cynical after all this time. Or perhaps just, could be a reflection of the place that we're in. And the state of the world. So I'm not entirely sure. We do need to level up, so let's do that.
Ashen, retreating into darkness beyond. Farewell, Ashen One. May the flames guide thee.
So if you're unsure as to why I just leveled up my faith to 12, then, yeah. That should become apparent by the end of this episode. So she does have a prayer that she says while you're leveling up. There are no subtitles given for it, and it's difficult to isolate the sound without first turning off the sound effects and the music, which I didn't just do. And what's more is that I don't want to just sit there while it's playing for a minute, because I can't exactly recall where it begins and where it ends. So at some point, either later in this episode or in an upcoming one, I will take the dialogue from either Surfist or Moonlight Butterfly, both of whom have I think, all of the Dark Souls 3 dialogue on their respective YouTube channels, and a link to which to both of which can be found in the video description. So we will cover that at some point. But again, that can be seen as another sort of quasi-reference to Demon Souls. Because when you're leveling up in Demon Souls, the Maiden in Black does something very similar. So I'm aware of the fact that if we do want to summon Swordmaster for the for Vort, then we do have to go kill him. I was hoping that we wouldn't have to do it just yet, but we're going to hold off on that a little bit longer. And perhaps head to the High Wall first. So the first thing that struck me during my blind playthrough, and I'm going to be referencing my blind playthrough a lot, simply because even though not everyone notices everything on their first playthrough, I think that first impressions are important. And so, to a certain degree, you can look at first impressions as a way of gauging what it was that... Because, the developers might try to do things in a certain way or arrange things in a particular manner so as to ensure that, you notice a certain thing when you go into a certain place. And yeah, my first impression when I came here was, hey, look, there's another coiled sword, but we can't take it with us. And I wondered aloud to myself whether this might be a vestige of the mechanic that my understanding was supposed to be in the game. And that is of the bonfires, that we would make bonfires ourselves. And I think that's precisely what this is. And again, to reiterate what I said in the previous episode, I've not really watched or read much of anything with respect to other people's interpretations of things, so I might be saying something that's obvious to others, or that others have already covered and debunked, but just bear that in mind when I'm speculating like this. But it would make perfect sense for us to spawn here, and if this were an item that we could pick up, and then carry with us in the same way that we carried the coiled sword that we took out of Udex Gundyr. And then we would have a choice of where to place the bonfire. And so the fact that this mechanic is no longer in the game is what seems to have led to what a lot of people have criticized about the game, and that is the abundance, or perhaps the overabundance of bonfires. And we'll talk about my interpretation of that, and it is something that I am disappointed about, because I think that would have been really, really cool. But it does seem as though they've taken, instead of going with the approach that was used in any one of the previous games, they've combined the approaches of several games. So, at the beginning of each area, you get a bonfire, just as you get a bonfire in the beginning of each Chalice dungeon in Bloodborne. Similarly, just as in Bloodborne and in Demon Souls, after you defeat a boss, that boss spawns a checkpoint. Whereas in Bloodborne it was lamps, and in Demon Souls they were archstones, I believe. In Dark Souls 3, obviously, they're bonfires. And so, but whereas in Bloodborne and in Demon Souls, you couldn't sit at those checkpoints. You can sit at bonfires. And so I think that's where the tension comes from in terms of, oh my gosh, there are way too many bonfires in this game. Is that it seems like late in development they decided for one reason or another that they had to scrap this mechanic. Maybe they didn't have time to finish it. Maybe it didn't work as well as they thought it was going to. And so, the best they could do was, hey, let's just combine all the approaches from the previous games. Because maybe they just went with the Dark Souls 2 or the Dark Souls 1 system, and maybe that made the game, it screwed with the game balance. It was too imbalanced like that. Because clearly, your attention is meant to be drawn to this, with the rays of light coming through the boarded up window. And perhaps previously you would have spawned looking this way, but since it's been taken out, we spawn looking this way. So I don't know, that's all speculation, but I came to that idea when I was preparing for this episode. So the High Wall of Lothric. So as in Bloodborne Let's Talk Lore, we're going to be doing a fair bit of just looking off into the landscape, and obviously can't do a whole lot of that right now when we don't have the binoculars, but we're going to try and get that. Binoculars are right over there. But that up there is Lothric Castle, obviously. That is the Grand Archives. There's that bridge. So I'm pointing to wherever the heck my head is. So that's the Grand Archives there. This is the bridge that leads up to the Twin Princes. And I guess up there is the Twin Princes' chamber. So we can see that from Firelink Shrine. And when we're at Firelink Shrine, we also see mountains. And what is that over there? Is that, I think that's the Cathedral of the Deep. So we can see mountains at Firelink Shrine, but I can't figure out a vantage point from which you can actually view Firelink Shrine. Because I'm very intrigued by the possibility that Firelink Shrine might be in an alternate dimension, in a Dreamlands-esque dimension, if not Purgatory, as Theomedy suggested. So someone mentioned in the comments of the previous episode, and I don't have the comments in front of me, but we will cover it later, that the giant tree in Firelink Shrine isn't necessarily there for no reason, or isn't necessarily there specifically for gameplay reasons, and not for lore reasons. And they mentioned the hollow trees as an example of that, and I think that's actually pretty apt. That perhaps the giant tree is there not as a lore red herring and as a, gameplay only thing, but perhaps to get us thinking about what the giant trees were in order to help us understand what these things are. The hollow trees, I believe the commenter called them. And I did receive my official guide, and I must say I'm rather disappointed. Because whereas the Future Press guide had area names, like sub-area names that weren't in the game, the Prima guide doesn't really seem to. So that's a little disappointing. So I don't know to what extent I'm going to rely on it. I will look to it to see whether or not, there are things to be gleaned from it, but yeah, I must say I'm somewhat disappointed. See, because I was hoping that, like, maybe that guy there, the ones who hold the lamp and alert all of the currently passive enemies, I was thinking that maybe they would have a specific name that would help us actually figure out what their function is, but unfortunately it does not seem to be the case. So these here, I think it's a pretty safe assumption to say that these are Firekeepers. Again, I could be wrong about that. Someone else could have already looked at that and debunked it thoroughly, but the Firekeeper robe, if you look at it, I believe does actually have, it has a hood hanging off of it. So my first thought was, oh no, these couldn't be Firekeepers because they have hoods on. But if you look at the Firekeeper set, it does look like there's a hood hanging off the back that, you know, could be put over their head. But for one reason or another, they're not. And yeah, so Firekeepers tending to the flame on their candle, so kind of symbolic. And these hollows here, it seems almost like they're praying to their fallen comrades, or that they're just simply mimicking what they're seeing the trees doing. And the trees seem almost to be reaching out. I think it's something JSF mentioned in his blind playthrough of Dark Souls 3, that it's almost like photosynthesis, that they're reaching out, seemingly, towards the sun. So the sun is there, or something approximating the sun. And they're reaching in that direction. No, they're not all reaching out for this. Oh, well, I guess the sun, the planet does rotate and the sun does move in the sky, so it's not entirely impossible for that to be the case. But yeah, I'm very interested to hear if anyone has any ideas about that. Here we have a wyvern. And you can see that there's ashes flying off of it. Or it's shedding ashes. Indicating perhaps that it's been here for a very, very long time. Because they're petrified, I believe. But yeah, so this is something that I've long been confused about. But I think I finally understand, at least to some degree, what the distinctions are between the likes of wyverns, drakes, and dragons. A wyvern is said, in more or less all the places I looked, to be a winged two-legged dragon with a barbed tail. Now what's interesting, and I think was the primary source of confusion about that for me, is the fact that this is what the dragons from A Song of Ice and Fire, Game of Thrones are said to look like. They don't have 4 legs, or 2 legs and 2 arms. They just have 2 legs, and their arms are wings, effectively. But in Game of Thrones, the dragons, and A Song of Ice and Fire, the dragons are effectively wyverns, if we're to use this sort of distinction definition of them. Whereas the dragons... Oh, something I meant to do was to look back at the footage from my casual playthrough. So, for a lot of the footage I'm going to pull in from Dark Souls 1, I'm probably going to do it for my casual playthrough, simply because it's a huge pain in the rear to set up my 360 to be captured, because I have to pull my desk out from against the wall and then move all the HDMI cables around, and that's an enormous pain to do. So I meant to look and see what the everlasting dragon in Ash Lake, what he looks like, or it looks like, I should say. Because in the official guide, these are stated not to be wyverns but dragons. And I guess perhaps they could be said to be dragons and just not everlasting dragons? But that seems kind of inconsistent to me. So I don't know. I really don't know. Binoculars! So down there we can see Farron Keep. That is the Grand Archives / Lothric Castle, I guess. And as I mentioned, there's the bridge that leads us to the Twin Princes. And at the top, that's, I guess, the Twin Princes' chamber. And so this is a very, very interesting and very intricate place. So insofar as we do wind up not splitting this episode into 2 parts, we will certainly return at some point to explore it in greater depth. We shall see. Because yeah, this dragon is completely petrified. So to finish my thought, I was under the impression that these enemies here were called deserters because, yeah, they're drops. So when I was practicing with one of the other builds we're going to be using in this playthrough, and that's something I'll go over later because we had a couple of questions relating to that. How it is that we're going to handle different quest lines and whatnot. With one of the several builds that we're going to be using, other than this one, our Aegon of Astora build, yeah, I got the drops for the pants, and they were called deserter trousers or something like that. But in the official guide, all of the enemies are just, you know, generic, large, hollow, things like that. They're just really generic, which I understand. That's, you know, sometimes that's just how FromSoft names them. But I was hoping that there would be more. There would be more to it than that. Actually, before we go this way... Oh, crud. We can't go back. We just went down a one-way drop. I was going to say, before we go this way, we should go get the longbow on the other side. But it looks like that's going to have to wait. Can he not come in here? I don't think he can. So this wyvern here is very, very interesting. I don't know if we're going to be able to get a good look at him from here. But this is, I believe, the same wyvern that we run into in Lothric Castle. One of 2 wyverns we come across in the game who is infected with the pus of man. That over there is, I think they're called avaricious creature in the guide, mimic. So we're going to leave that for now. When we come back to get the mimic, we'll deal with the dragon then as well. And we come across our first Lothric knight. Sometimes he notices when you're standing there. Other times he does not. So we're just going to leave him for now and grab this bonfire. Oh. See you, friend. So yeah, I think this is just going to end up being a really long episode because we do have a fair number of comments I want to get to. I believe if you try shooting the wyvern from here, he breathes fire over at us, so we're not going to do that, but I am trying to see if there's any indication of the infection. So pus, a thick yellowish or greenish opaque liquid produced in infected tissue, consisting of dead white blood cells and bacteria with tissue, debris, and serum. So, pus of man would then seem to indicate that it is that man or humanity is the infected tissue out of which the pus of man emerges. So the infection isn't the pus itself, but the pus is an indication. The pus isn't the phenomenon, it's the epiphenomenon. So that is a phenomenon that indicates the existence of another phenomenon. Because this is the one I believe that faces us on the left when we're facing it later in Lothric Castle. And so if it's facing us on the left, then yeah, it's right arm, or is it its right leg? I can't recall. But yeah, we're wasting a lot of time here, so I'll just leave that for now. But something to think about. And we are going to be talking a little bit more about the pus of man later on. And the location of the dark sign, among several other things. So, high wall. So this is basically a defensive fortification. And this is what I was most hoping, why I was most hoping for names of areas, such as those that we got in the Bloodborne official guide. Because we know, like, at least we have the bonfire names, we know that that bonfire is called Tower on the Wall. And so it's really hard to tell whether it looks almost like these are quarters for the knights that worked here, or that were stationed here, I guess I should say. Come on, friend. Aren't you supposed to ambush me? And that makes me feel really guilty every time I walk by these hollows, because, yeah, they're worshipping, and then it's almost like they're just super frightened. Presumably by our presence. There you are. Hi. Doing your best Gundar impression there, aren't you? Well done. Okay. So speaking of pus of man, we have a very interesting set piece coming up here. One for which I'm only partially prepared for, so let's see how this goes. Do you want to try and aggro him while we're in the binoculars? Let's see if that's even possible. I meant to get a much better look at it than that, but that's gonna have to do. And so, a very interesting story point about this. And one that I think has been true through basically all of the Dark Souls games. I don't know where I am. There I am. that fire is opposed to dark. And that if you hit the pus of man right in the pussy part with fire, then it effectively completely disables them. I'm sorry, friend. You guys can go back to doing what you were doing. The mean guy is gone. I promise. At least for now. But we'll get back to that in a minute. And so down here, we have a winged knight who is wearing blue. And all throughout the High Wall, and especially in Castle Lothric proper, we find indications that all was not necessarily well among the Lothric forces. There appears to have been a sort of Lothric civil war. And that's not a subject about which I'm especially knowledgeable, but again, another one where I'm looking forward to learning about that alongside and from all of you. This statue here, I know there are different opinions about this, but it does seem to me as though, and this is something we'll return to once we actually get the weapon that this statue appears to be holding, but it appears to be holding the profane greatsword. I know that there are again, some others that have very different ideas about this. Theomany thinks it's a different sword entirely. And I know she has very well thought out reasons for that. But I don't know what those reasons are, so I'm not going to speculate on that. But at least at first blush, it does look very much like the profane greatsword. It is not what I was trying to do. I was trying to explode those barrels, but it didn't work. So I think we're actually going to use a Homer bone, and the reason for which you'll see in a minute. So something we talked about in the context of Bloodborne Let's Talk lore. But something that bears repeating based on the fact that it appears to be more or less uniform across all of the Souls games. Oh, sorry, friends. They're so scared. I'm sorry. And that is the reason why enemies respawn. So in every Souls game, there are unique enemies that don't respawn. You kill them once, they're gone. And the reason for that is that they are unique enemies. There's only one of them. Respawning enemies, on the other hand, when an enemy respawns, it doesn't mean that the enemy themselves, it doesn't mean that the enemy is undead. It could mean that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. So that is to say that the respawning mechanic isn't to indicate that an enemy is undead, but rather to indicate that there are a certain number of enemies, that there are more of them. So when you sit at a bonfire, and you go back to a place where there was an enemy, And if the enemy respawns, that's not the same enemy that you're fighting again. What that actually is a different enemy. But just that there are so many of them. And this does require, of course, a certain suspension of disbelief. Especially when there are enemies set up in the same spot. So like this guy here, who's meant to wait until you get attacked by the hollow that was hanging off the ledge, and then climb up the ladder and then get you from the front. So it is, it does require some suspension of disbelief to think that this is a completely different guy than the hollow who did that to us previously. But that is what the game is trying to say, that this is a different enemy. So it follows from that there is just an enormous amount, a countless number of hollows. But what also follows from that is that there are a countless number of hollows infected with a countless number of hollows who have whatever the infected flesh is of humanity that causes the pus of men to shoot forth from their body, or to emerge from their body. Because when we walk over here a second time, so it is significant, I think, that this is not a unique enemy. It shows that the problem is incredibly widespread in Lothric. And I think that I don't know what the significance of that is, other than perhaps as being just another indication of how screwed up the world is that we're in. But it matters, I think, that that's not a single spawn enemy. I think that is FromSoft trying to say this is a bigger problem than just a single enemy. Because it's strong enough to the point where when you fight an enemy that's that strong and that hard to kill, you expect them to be a unique spawn, and not a countless spawn like this one is. And that's one area where, even though in terms of the game mechanics, I was sympathetic to people who were upset about this in Dark Souls 2, the fact that you could eventually despawn the enemies in an area. But that was one example of where, even though Dark Souls 2 departed from a, familiar mechanic, even though it was only 2 games old at that point, a familiar mechanic of having the enemies respawn endlessly. What are you shooting at, friend? But the fact that the enemies despawn was actually really clever, if you think about it, because you could farm an area, and again, this is separating the mechanical side effects of that from, the gameplay or the story reason for it being there. But if you do that, it's really clever because it shows that there isn't an infinite number of hollows, but that there are many, or whatever the enemy is in a given area. But that they stop respawning, I think, after something like 15 times of having been killed. And I always thought that was a clever way of getting around the whole respawning mechanic, indicating that, there's just an endless stream of enemies. So that Lothric Knight. When I played through this area in preparation for this episode, that Lothric Knight kicked my rear over and over and over again. So let's see if we can't avoid that. We just got a refill on our Estus. So that's a mechanic I don't understand. And the last I checked, Illusory Wall was doing some extensive testing on it, and the last I checked, I believe that Illusory Wall concluded that he concluded that it seems to be almost completely random, or at least there's a significant element of RNG involved in whether killing a particular enemy gives you Estus. But yeah, I don't know if there's been any further clarification on that. Undead Hunter Charm, tool used to hunt down the undead, blocks Estus recovery within a limited area. Used long ago by Lloyd's cleric knights on their undead hunts, although Allfather Lloyd is long forgotten by the Way of White. His hunts have lived on, and this charm allows one to challenge undead without fear of tenacious healing. So Allfather Lloyd was one of those instances from Dark Souls 1 where I wasn't entirely familiar with what his significance was in the overall story. We did it! And we just got another Estus flask, so I don't know how that's supposed to work. I had also heard that playing offline means that the rate at which your Estus refills is much lower, but again, I don't know if that's just speculation or if that's been confirmed or not. So this appears to be some sort of armory. But again, it would have been really nice to have, and I keep harping on that, but so I'm going to stop. But it would have been nice to have the names of specific sub-areas. Because I don't know nearly enough, and by nearly enough, I mean I know basically nothing about medieval castles and how they were designed and what all the various things mean. So this is a hell of a room here. And so remember earlier when I leveled my faith up to 12? And I said, if it's not already obvious why I'm doing that, it will be soon. Astora Straightsword, a well-crafted sword named after the ruined land. Astora, before its fall, was a land replete with royal blood, and this weapon is both a reminder and heirloom of that era. That awkward moment when you realize your home is ruined. So yeah, we're going to be, at least for the time being, using the Astora Straightsword. Which is why we leveled our faith up to 12. So we're doing marginally better damage than we were with the straight sword, but that's fine. I am, as you'll see whenever I reveal the second build, which we're going to be using in this playthrough, I am very big on theme builds. So to me, the damage doesn't matter as much as it does just sticking to the theme, and that is, this build is Aegon of Astora, so of course he would use the Astora Straightsword. I don't know how we're going to handle this, beyond using firebombs. Oh, hi friends. And again, once I've been able to power level a little bit, there will be less of this where I'm having to carefully manage an engagement in order to ensure that I don't die. But until such time as that becomes a thing, this is what we're going to have to deal with. That's not carefully managing an engagement at all. Oh, crud. That ain't good. I thought we were goner there for sure. Okay. There's a broadsword in here. Nothing especially interesting in the item description, though. Okay, I think we're ready to take on the rest of this spot now. Same with the Silverkite Eagle Shield. Nothing really very interesting from a lore perspective. So we're not going to read that description. So again, I apologize if if me really carefully managing this whole engagement is boring, but better this, I think, than me dying and having to come back here and do it all over again, so. Sorry, friend. Because we came here looking for that cell key, which we'll get to in just 1 second. I just want to make sure it's safe first. And the Essus shard, of course. Cell key. Key to a cell holding thieves and the like. There is no shortage of brash thieves in Lothric, and these particular thieves likely scaled the wall from the undead settlement. But they are only willing to practice their thievery on the high wall for their fear of Lothric Castle, rumored to devour men, keeps them clear of its grounds. Very, very interesting. And I think this is the first Souls game. And I know that I mapped certain class issues onto Bloodborne in a way that not everyone agreed with, but that I think was certainly valid. But I think Dark Souls 3 is the first of the Souls games to really explicitly invoke some class-related issues, which we will probably get into in greater depth once we reach the Undead settlement. Similarly, the Road of Sacrifices and the Cathedral of the Deep, together with the Undead settlement, also seem to invoke a lot of issues in and around colonialism. So, something to think about. But it will be, of course, a little while before we get to those areas. The fact that I'm recording this today, only a few days after I recorded the first episode, is sure to be a very rare occurrence in this series, but I do have a couple days left of summer break before I have to get back to teaching and to more intensely working on dissertation-related things. So that's why I'm trying my best to get as much done for the channel now, while I have a little bit of spare time before the academic year starts and all that spare time is gone. So I'm trying to see where this leads down to. Looks like just a chasm of some sort. And again, more hints that there's something going on here. That this winged knight wearing blue is just has all sorts of weapons sticking out of its body, and it's reaching seemingly in a last-ditch effort to do something about whomever just stabbed him all these times, is reaching out for its weapon, and was obviously unsuccessful. And then right next to it we have all of these red Lothric knights, all of whom none of whom seem to have heads. So this imagery will become more and more abundant when we enter Lothric Castle proper, and so perhaps that'll be a better time to deal with that, seeing as we're already at an hour and a half of my recording right now. But I'd be interested in hearing anyone's thoughts on the matter either way. Oh, that was a dumb thing to do. Okay, we'll come back for him. Because we gotta go open up the shortcut and get ourselves a bow. And there's statues there of Lothric knights holding their heads. So yeah, I do think we're going to split this up into 2 parts, actually. Because I'm rushing at this point, and I don't want to rush things. So let's open up the shortcut, and then I think we're going to head back to Firelink from there and talk about some comments. Because we've still lots to talk about here. And I don't want the second episode of the series to be 3 hours long. I try to keep solo episodes. This was never my thing initially, but towards the end of Let's Talk Lore, which of Bloodborne Let's Talk Lore, which wound up being a completely different, not completely different, but a largely different series than what I had. Than how I originally imagined it would turn out. But so a lot of the present ideas and the structure with which I've presented this episode and the prior one are informed not by me. Like, of course, it's in part by me, but a lot of the things I do and that I'm planning on doing were informed by comments made on that previous series. So. And, but in this case it was, once I started having guests on, I decided, okay, the maximum sort of length for an episode should be 3 hours if there's a guest involved. And what I do want to try and do is to keep the episodes where it's just featuring me alone, solo. I want to keep those episodes under 2 hours. So that's what we're going to do. That's why we're going to end it shortly, or at least start dealing with comments shortly. But we do want to go get that bow first, so let's go do that. That also means that not only are we going to have to deal with this guy, but there is another Pus of Man enemy up top. So let's go see. He really doesn't look all that different from the others. It's obviously a little bit darker, it doesn't have any clothing on its upper half, whereas the others do. But what I would love to be able to do, and maybe I'll recruit someone to help me with that at a later date, because what JSF did for his Bloodborne Up Close series was invaded people, and then, went and checked out the enemies up close in that way. But there was no soapstone in Bloodborne, so obviously he had to just do it with random people. But what we could do theoretically in this is I could have someone summon me as a red, and then I could just go and look at enemies and get footage of that. In the safety of being an invader. So maybe that's something we'll do, but for now, in the interest of not lengthening the episode any more than we already have, we'll just leave them. So again, more hollows, seemingly mimicking this tree here. And so maybe this is meant to suggest that they've been sitting there doing this for so very long that... I really don't know. I really do not know. Alright, you know what? I know I've already changed my mind several times, but... let's go talk to Emma, if nothing else. We do have a lot of stuff to deal with in the courtyard. That was almost really bad. That was almost really, really bad. We do have several enemies to deal with in the courtyard and some item descriptions to read, people to talk about. So we're going to go talk to Emma because the conversation with Emma was the basis upon which, and we also have Lion Knight Albert here to deal with, but... conversation with Emma served as the basis upon which I meant to respond to a couple of comments, so we should talk to Emma first.
The wait has been long, unkindled one. I am Emma, High Priestess of Lothric Castle. Allow me to speak frankly. You will not find the Lords of Cinder here. They have left, gone, to their churning homes converging at the base of this castle. Head to the bottom of the high wall, forge on through the great gate, and raise this banner to proceed. This farewell gift is for you. It is the insignia of an old covenant. If you fear trespassers, dark spirits drawn by the embers, then etch this upon your heart, and the old Concord will beckon noble blue sentinels to hunt these foul spirits. Unkindled one, head to the high wall's base. Go through the great gate and raise this banner to proceed. But beware. The dog keeps a close eye on things. The vile watchdog of the Boreal Valley. Unkindled.
Okay, maybe I have to come back later for that dialogue. But she does have some dialogue where she says something to the effect of...
What is wrong, Unkindled one? Are you not a Lord Seeker? Head to the base of the high wall and seek the Lords of Cinder. Is this not the calling of your kind since ages past?
You know, since ages past or something like that? Which muddies things further that I was talking about earlier with respect to the plan and where it went wrong in terms of the institution of Link in the Fire. If we were raised from the dead only as a failsafe in the event that the Lords of Cinder refuse to return to their throne. Because recall that the bell tolls in the first place for the Lords of Cinder to awaken. But the way the narrator puts it in the introduction sounds as though unkindled ash rise only when the Lords of Cinder don't return to their thrones. So which led me to wonder whether or not this was the first time that had happened. Is it just, circumstance that has led all of the Lords of Cinder at once to just, other than Ludleth, because he doesn't go anywhere, but has that led them all to return? Unless Ludleth actually does travel, and he was the only one who reported when he was supposed to. I don't know. So all things to think about. So it's probably for the best that we're not finishing this area today, because I've not really added or provided a lot of insight into things so much as I've just been questioning things, which will constitute a considerable portion of this series, of course. But if we leave the rest of this place for now, that'll at least give everyone an opportunity to share their thoughts on things. And to, perhaps guide me a little bit. But okay, let's head back. So I was wrong. The NPC we needed to talk to in order so I could address a comment was actually Greirat. This is what you get when you rush. Ay, ay, ay. What was I thinking? Sorry, everyone. Okay. So again, looks like this was where a guard was stationed. And it's a pretty big cell for just one person, so I'm going to assume that when this place was still actually in operation, that there were probably several people held in here. And so this is something that was the subject of a great deal of discussion during my blind playthrough, was my first reaction, and apparently those of many other people playing the game for the first time who had played the prior games, is that they assumed that this person was going to be much like Lothric from Dark Souls 1, and that we were going to free him and that he was going to do something terrible as a consequence of that. But yeah, the one way of looking at how it eventually turns out is that this was FromSoft trying to subvert the player's expectations. That we're expecting that this guy is going to come back to Firelink and effectively, you know, murder everyone or do something terrible. When in fact, yeah, he's really not a bad guy at all.
Ah. You're no jailer, are you? No, you're from far away. And judging by the bell, you must be some of that unkindled ash. Remarkable. If that's true, then I have a favor to ask. Below the high wall is a musty little town, not the home of any lord, just a very old settlement of undead. An old woman, Loretta, lives there. Please, give her this ring. I'm not asking for charity. In fact, if you do this for me, I'll be sure to repay you in kind. I may be a petty thief, but I've more wits than most royalty. What do you say then, huh? Very well. I humbly place my faith in you. I am Greirat of the Undead settlement, and I promise to assist you. Give this ring to old Loretta at the base of the high wall. Do your part, and I'll do mine.
So, the comment to which I'm referring was left by someone whose name, I'm sorry, I'm not even going to try and pronounce that just because I'm sure I will butcher it. But I do recognize this name from Let's Talk Lore, provided some very helpful comments with respect to translations and whatnot. So, this person writes, maybe you will meet Greirat in the next episode. So I think it is good to point out that his dialogue is very interesting with regards to the untended graves, where he says, you're no jailer, are you? No, you're from far away, and judging by the bell, you must be some of that unkindled ash. So, in the first place, contradicting what I was just saying when we were speaking with Emma, about the possibility that this is the first time that unkindled ash has risen in order to account for the fact that the lords hadn't returned to their thrones. Because if Greirat knows that the bell ringing and, some weird person from far away coming and showing up here, if he knows that that means that we're unkindled to ash, then there's no possible way that this is the first time that that's happened. And then the second really interesting thing that's brought up by this comment is, as the commenter writes, but the bell in the untended grave never rang. So, where we are is presumably closer to the untended graves than it is to Firelink Shrine. Although that's entirely unclear, because the geography... Not only is the geography unclear from the outset, and I think purposely so in many instances, FromSoft also does a fair bit of trickery with respect to their map design to give things the illusion of connecting far more than they actually do. It is very hard to say how much you can rely on the way that things appear in the game to make connections for, trying to chart the geography of the area. But it does raise that very interesting question, that how would he have heard it if the Firelink Shrine bell, because the bell in the untended graves does not ring. So how would Greirat have been able to hear it if it was in another dimension that the bell rang? So Passy also replied to that particular comment, writing, "Personally, I think this probably points to the idea that Firelink is indeed geographically connected to Lothric. At least that's been my viewpoint from the very beginning. This, in my eyes, doesn't even contradict the idea that Firelink/Cemetery of Ash could have could be some form of purgatory. The lands are converging, but who's to say that these lands have always been physical prior to the convergence? It could have been some sort of non-physical manifestation before and then pulled into the physical world." So very, very interesting in that it's almost an inverse of the Bergenworth Lecture Hall in Bloodborne, which was said to have been pulled into the nightmare from the waking world. The background geography is pretty much consistent throughout the entire game. You see the icy mountains numerous times throughout the game, and Firelink/Cemetery is indeed surrounded by what are presumably the same icy mountains. There's an argument to be made that these could potentially be entirely different mountains and not related in any way, which is entirely valid, but I can't say I'm fond of that idea personally. So that's why we had to go talk to Greirat, just because of those two very interesting comments, which... shed a lot of light, I think, on the possibilities and the enormous number of possibilities that actually exist for this thing that we've been talking about for the last 2 episodes. Okay, so before we get to the rest of the comments, I just wanted to say thank you to all of you sincerely for not only an overwhelming number of comments, but also an overwhelming outpouring of support and just kindness, kind words that everyone shared their excitement with the series starting. And I guess I should apologize for having kept you all waiting for so long. I didn't know that everyone was anticipating it that eagerly. But also, I hope you understand why I had to delay the start of the series, because if I'm burned out and if my heart isn't in it, then, it wouldn't be the same anyway. So I think the episodes would have been far less enjoyable as a result. So thank you all again. And as I went on and on about in the previous episode, I sincerely wish that I could cover every single comment that was left, because there's so much great stuff there, but we only really have the time for a small handful. So again, please don't take it personally, and please don't take it as a slight on you towards you as a person. If I don't read your comment, it's simply just because there are so many of them and they're all great, and so I have to sometimes just pick one here, one there, when, say, I'm at my computer and I refresh my comment feed and someone just left a really great comment. Then, again, happenstance. Sometimes I just take comments in that way. And usually you'll have a bit more time to leave your comments, because I'm recording this, again, less than 2 days after I released the first one. So these were all more or less selected from the earliest batch of comments. So don't feel like you need to rush to leave your comments right away, because rare the case will be when I'm actually recording the next episode so soon after releasing the previous one. So with all that said, Alistair writes with respect to the placement of the dark sign on the body. From what I can tell, it can appear anywhere with no specific spot. If you'll recall, Lucatiel of Mira in Dark Souls 2 had her dark sign on her face, over one of her eyes. Also in Dark Souls 1, if you looked at hollows in that game, where their sign was indicated by a veiny looking growth on their chest. Hopefully you, or at least someone else, finds this info both interesting and helpful. So it was certainly helpful for me in forcing me to go back and look at the various different indications of hollowing from the previous games. So starting with Dark Souls 1, Alistair is correct in that the hollows in Dark Souls 1 all have a sort of veiny looking growth coming out of the left side of their chest. So it looks like their left lung. But I don't know if it follows that this is supposed to be the dark sign, because it could be something else. Like, again, it could be a matter of phenomenon versus an epiphenomenon, that the veiny growth is meant to indicate something else, but that isn't itself the dark sign. But I could be wrong about that as well. So that's Dark Souls 1. In this respect, Dark Souls 2 is actually the outlier. If you look at Lucatiel, yes, Lucatiel does have something going on with her face. So if you look at the left side of her face, you can see that it's very clearly, she's hollowing, visibly. But I don't know if it's that the dark sign can necessarily appear anywhere, or if that is indeed itself the dark sign, or a dark sign. As much as it is perhaps that, because Lucatiel is generally wearing a mask. And when Lucatiel takes off her mask, it seems that they wanted that to be a big moment where it reveals that there's something going on with her, that she is herself, in fact, going hollow. Because if you listen back to her dialogue, she only talks about hollows sort of as something that other people are dealing with. When it becomes apparent later in the game that she's talking not only about her brother, but also about herself.
Have you heard of the undead? These poor souls affected by the curse.
An undead gradually loses his humanity until his wits degrade completely.
Finally, he turns hollow and preys upon others. You... What's become of you? I won't die in this foul place. My dear brother.
So her taking off her mask and revealing to the player that there's something going on, that she seems to be hollowing. If indeed the thing on her face is supposed to be a dark sign, out of which the curse is sort of pouring and taking over her whole body, or if perhaps that, because, it is also entirely possible that the dark side could have been on her shoulder and then extended towards her face as she hollowed more and more. I think that is personally more likely. Either that or, perhaps they changed the rules so that, because, Lucatiel doesn't take off her garb, so you don't get to see whether there is a dark sign on her back shoulder, because this is something interesting that I actually, either I'd never noticed it or I completely forgotten about it, because, I mentioned in the previous episode that if you look at that the intro to Dark Souls 2 is the only place where you actually see the dark sign physically branded on someone. I was wrong. So what I did was I went and I took one of my builds and I hollowed them fully. And it's possible that it's just because, for the longest time I was playing Dark Souls 2, human effigies were really plentiful, so I really had no reason to be hollow, and no reason to not be wearing a shirt or armor or something. So I just didn't see it. But if you see, it's very clear that on the back left shoulder of the player character, there is some sort of swirling vortex, which resembles that which we see in the introduction, and maybe we'll deal with that later. But yeah, in Dark Souls 2, it's very clearly centered, at least on the player character's body, and in the introduction on the back left shoulder. Just to make absolutely sure, I also looked at the front side of the player character, and there's no analogous indication to that of the hollows in Dark Souls 1 or 3, where it sort of has this growth on the chest. It looks really gross, to be sure, but there's no discernible pattern to the growth there. And then I went to go check out some of the NPC hollows, because I figured, okay, that's the player character, that's the introduction's one thing, but what about the other enemies in the game? So I went to the Grave of Saints to check out the 2 hollows that are right there in the entrance, because they are passive up to a point, and because they freak me out. But also because, I figured it would be easy to get a good shot of whether or not they have something on their chest or on their back shoulder. So nothing on their chest, just like the player character. But again, just like the player character, these hollows have a swirling sort of vortex of a dark sign on their back left shoulder. I don't think it's unreasonable to say that either Lucatiel was made into an exception in Dark Souls 2, specifically within the context of Dark Souls 2, that they made the swirling vortex go around her eye because, the player character doesn't get to see her shoulder. But when she takes off her mask, they wanted it to be visible to the player, for that to be a big moment, like, oh my gosh, she's hollowing too. So either it was an exception in that way, that they wanted that to be a big moment, the reveal when she takes off her mask, or that simply it just extended up from her left shoulder, because the mark on her face is on her left side. So it's not entirely unreasonable, again, to suggest that perhaps it just stretched up from her left shoulder, and that thus indicating an advanced stage of hollowing. But again, that would kind of be an exception, because these hollows are pretty far gone. Sure, their skin is an absolute mess, but they don't, half of their face isn't black, so I don't really know. But that's Dark Souls 2. And then if we look at Dark Souls 3, it does look almost identical to what we see in Dark Souls 1, in that on the left side of the player character's chest, there is a growth. And what's more than that, and this is a very interesting, fascinating, tiny little detail. If you look in the top left, when your player character is hollowed, you can see what is essentially the same pattern where the Covenant symbol should be. Whether you're embered or not, it's always visible, the exact same pattern. So I don't know what that means for Udex Gundyr, or for, whether there is any specific place for the dark sign to grow. But I don't think that it's necessarily the case that this growth on the left side of the chest is supposed to be the dark sign. If anything, perhaps it is a growth on top of the dark sign. But what's interesting is that it's not only on the left side of the chest, but it also extends around to the back too. So I don't know. Just something for everyone to think about, I guess. Nicole Dubois writes that the Pus of Man has had me fascinated since the day of release, and I am still not sure how it fits in. In some ways I see it as dark running wild, Ian B's theory, but at other times it feels so root-like or draconic that I keep thinking about it. It happens infrequently, and I feel like it sticks out so boldly from everything else. I hope more is learned about it through this playthrough. Well, you and me both. But Nicole's comment got me thinking, with the term dark running wild, is that the Pus of Man is very reminiscent to me of the Soul of Manus, which, if you'll recall, and I have an especially low quality screenshot taken from a 720p video capture from my 360, so it's really bad, and I tried to clean it up a bit, but I think in the process I actually made it worse. But what the Soul of Manus essentially is a humanity sprite from Dark Souls 1, but with just tendrils of black stuff growing out of it. That seems to be more or less what they're getting after. That it's the same idea. Pus of Man is an indication of an infection on the surface of humanity. Whereas in Dark Souls 1, it was just humanity gone wild. And maybe those two things are different, maybe they're the same, but there certainly seems to be a connection there. But part of the problem with looking at the Soul of Manus is the fact that the item description images in both Dark Souls 1 and 2 are really small, really low resolution. Whereas in Dark Souls 3, they've increased the resolution considerably on some of the images. And DeLawrence Perkins attuned us to one instance where this seems to have led to a very, very interesting discovery. So we're going to look at the source itself, which is from a Fex for Life user named Scarecrow13, who wrote a whole article on this subject, which I will leave a link to in the video description because I would highly recommend reading it for yourself because of how much effort this individual goes into providing caveats and qualifiers on the fickle nature of translation. I feel like in this community we really take for granted how incredibly complicated and how much uncertainty there is in translating things, because it's not just a straight one-to-one, this word means this thing in this language, and there are certain things that are taken for granted within a particular culture, and if that culture takes these things for granted and they only speak a particular language, then there are many things that won't be written out in a translation. So translation, as I'm sure we'll see time and again in this playthrough, is far more complicated than I think it's often made out to be in the context of our community. So that's why I would highly recommend that you go and check out this article for yourself by Scarecrow13, because they go to great lengths to actually explain the uncertainty involved in translating something like this. And so without further ado, the end result of all these qualifiers and caveats leads Scarecrow13 to write, "My interpretation is irrefutably correct because you can piece things together the way you think fits best. This also means that anyone having a different interpretation is also irrefutably correct. So then, like all psychics and divination attempts, this translation is for novelty purposes only." But with all that said, the way that this person seems to have interpreted it does make a fair bit of sense in the context of the story, and that is the first line reads, "The meek sought God, the divine, in the trees," that is the arch trees. A name I can't read, the tree of life, so again, the arch trees, "bestowed the gifts of plenty, joy, and health. They remained and hardship set in. They found a spark," so that is the Lord Souls in the first flame, "which turned into a sun, driving away the cold and ice. Terrible trouble came, so conflict with the dragons. The sun ended this conflict." So as we saw in the introduction of the first episode, this age, that is the Age of Light, continued and began an era of wealth and plenty. Man will, or has begun to, ascend. Cold and ice will return. So that's a very interesting little tidbit, and I do wonder whether there are any other interesting discoveries like that to come about through the fact that the screenshots we now have of the images for the items are a little bit higher resolution than those of previous games. Scion95 writes, "I notice that you keep referring to Henri as a she and her. I take it then that you'll only be playing as a male Ashen One in this series." Yes, primarily we will be using a male Ashen One, and part of the reason for that is that during my first playthrough I played as a male player character, because I tend to do that unless most of my builds are either some variation on Aegon of Astora, or I do a theme build. I tend not to do builds just for the sake of doing something different, for one reason or another, either theme builds or cosplay builds. Most of my female builds are some sort of theme builds or cosplay builds. But with that said, because I played as a male player character in my first playthrough, Henri was a woman as a result, which is something we'll talk about, but and so I will always see Henri in that way, because that's how Henri was on my first playthrough. Robert kindly left a comment to say that in the guide, those enemies are called the Grave Wardens, and that is the enemies in the Cemetery of Ash. So I very much appreciate that, Robert, and we are going to return to talk about those enemies either in the next episode or the episode after that, because there's something else I wanted to touch on with respect to them that became apparent to me once I picked up a particular item in the Undead settlement, but we'll return to that. Evan Wheat writes, "The idea of Yorm's design relative to the giant tree truly fascinates me, both as an individual study and as a general reflection of the tone of this game. When I first saw Yorm, I thought that the way giants are portrayed in Dark Souls had been retconned. However, the existence of a giant tree in Dark Souls 3 makes it apparent that Yorm is not a giant as we know it. After all, Yorm has a face under his hood, not to mention an actual neck and more human proportions. The giant tree, however, is exactly like the Dark Souls 2 design. What exactly is Yorm then? Is he simply a very large person, with giant being more of an adjective than a noun? Or is he a precursor or evolution of the giants from Dark Souls 2? Part of the genius of this game really is that we're given enough information to establish that there are some rules and things connect, but we aren't given the actual rules of this world itself. Very well said, Evan. I don't really have an answer to any of your questions, but I do think that you might have something with your suggestion that giant in Yorm the Giant might be more of an adjective than a noun. I think that's a good way of putting it. Fishmail writes, I gotta say that I am a firm believer that the Throne of Want transports the Dark Souls 2 character to a similar area that the third Firelink takes you, basically saying they just don't show the Lord of Cinder fight in Dark Souls 2. So that is a very, very, very interesting suggestion. And certainly a possibility in retrospect. I'm not sure if that's something we could have ever seen at the outset. But it was said in Dark Souls 2 that Nashandra covets the First Flame and the Great Soul. So if Nashandra's endgame was to gain access to the Throne of Want, and if that in some way, shape, or form was supposed to transport you to the Kiln, where you would wind up meeting the Soul of Cinder or something approximating the Soul of Cinder, I'm not sure. I do think that is a possibility, but when looking at the throne and how the player character sits in the throne, it seems almost more likely to me that we are becoming, and I guess those two aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, because you become a Lord of Cinder when you link the fire. But I did find it striking how similar the throne we sit in at the end of Dark Souls 2 is to those which we find in Firelink Shrine. So I don't know if that contradicts with what you're saying, Fishmail, but I do think that that's very interesting, and that's one way of looking at the Dark Souls 2 ending, which in retrospect makes it a lot richer than I previously perhaps gave it credit for. But yeah, thank you, Fishmail, because I wanted to get this out here so that others would think about that as well. The way they designed Dark Souls 3, I do think that they consciously took Dark Souls 2 into consideration, and I do think that they may have done certain things in the design of Dark Souls 3 in order to allow Dark Souls 2 to be viewed in a different light. And I think this might be one such example of that, so thank you. Misha kindly pointed out that I think I was pronouncing it Udex in the previous episode, but it's actually Udex. So, thank you. Pronunciation has never been my strong suit. I doubt it will ever become my strong suit going forward. So I do appreciate when people, not only when you point out that I've pronounced something incorrectly, but when the explanation is detailed in the way that Misha provided an explanation. So thank you kindly for that. Arakiz writes, given the Ember's description, Henri's status as an unkindled is all but confirmed. After all, if its flame reveals the summoning signs of other unkindled, which is from the item description, Henri must be one. And interestingly, so would be Horus, Cirrus, Orbeck, Aegon of Kareem, I think you meant to say, Uria, Londor, Pale Shade, and Blackhand Goddard. So yeah, that's very, very interesting, especially with respect to the likes of Lion Knight Albert. Because if they're people who exist in the world, and if they're part of, this Lothric regime, how could they also be unkindled? Unless the reference to the Ember revealing the summon signs of other unkindled is meant explicitly to be a reference to other players. But this might be another situation like that of Bloodborne, where at the outset we were trying to figure out why it was we were able to summon Gascoigne, because he shouldn't have had a small resonant bell unless he was once a Paleblood hunter, or unless there was, as I joked in I believe the second episode, a resonant bell factory in the old underground labyrinth. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure if the game means to imply that the likes of, again, like Lion Knight Albert, I'm not sure if the game means to imply that they are also unkindled like us. or if that's meant to refer specifically to other players. It could be a contradiction there, but that is a very good point, and I thank you very kindly for bringing it up. Rince Windus writes, pretty sure Henri picked up her stuff from Astora. Her sword was explicitly found in Astora, so she would have been there anyway. So again, that is one possibility, and I didn't mean to suggest in the previous episode that her not being from Astora was the only possibility, but I did want to concede that this is also a possibility, but also to point out that this is something we'll be talking about later. But when I throw out kind of my own position on something, I'm not saying that this is the only way it could possibly be. But just that that's one possibility, and perhaps if I'm discussing it at that point in time, that is the one that I prefer, but that doesn't mean it's right. So I just wanted to point that out. Rince Windus was also the person who I mentioned earlier alerted us to the potential connection between the hollow trees and the giant tree, but also writes that I really can't agree with the idea that there's a committee or institution choosing who gets to link the fire. The person chosen to link the fire is the one strongest to do so. The alternative is disaster, as Lothric's condition shows. So just to clarify, I never said that there's a committee or institution choosing who gets to link the fire, but only that there was a committee or an institution who may or may not have chosen Udex Gundyr as the person who judges who gets to proceed from the Cemetery of Ash. So those are two different things, and I never suggested that there was a committee choosing who gets to link the fire. Just that the name Udex seems to suggest that there is a committee who chose Gundyr in order to be the judge to see who's strong enough to be able to potentially link the fire. Dezo Penguin writes, one thing I wonder right off the beginning is, do you have a plan for which ending you intend to pursue? I say this because there are some very significant differences in NPC conversations and explorations in the nature of hollowing that are discussed in the Londor questline, but it also cuts off certain steps in Henri and Horace's quest path. Similarly, some of the conversations with the Firekeeper and Ludleth are activated in the Eyes event sequence, are rather leading. Or do you plan to perhaps cut in certain scenes from other playthroughs to highlight some of these alternative options? Or would you consider leaving it up to the community? So as I hinted at earlier, we are going to be using multiple builds in this playthrough. We're going to try and do basically everything. There may be some things that we're not able to do, but just as with the Bloodborne Let's Talk Lore playthrough, we'll probably be doing a fair bit of backing up of our saves so that we can pursue multiple options. But certainly we are going to get all of the endings, and we are going to explore as many branching paths of the NPC questlines as is possible. There may even be an in-playthrough storyline about the various player characters that we're utilizing. We'll see. That I'm kicking around some ideas about that. So similar to how in Let's Talk Lore, the Aegon of Astora build we were using started, suffering from the effects of having too high insight. So I have a couple of possible things planned for that. But rest assured that we are going to try our best, and so that's why, again, I said in the previous episode that this playthrough is going to be going on for a long time, and so I need everyone to bear with me because I do at least intend to do as much of the game as possible, to explore as much of it and to get as many alternative paths so that we can establish as full as we possibly can the conditions of possibility for the story. So again, there were many more comments I wanted to get to, and of the comments I did address, most of them were truncated considerably, so I hope that everyone will forgive me for that. But that's going to do it for this episode. Next time we're going to continue exploring the rest of the High Wall of Lothric, and so I look forward to hearing all your thoughts on the things that we discussed in this episode and the things that we'll be doing in the next one. But for the time being, thank you all very, very much for joining me, and I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.